Welcome. Today we are doing a comprehensive examination of a case that, for so many people living and working in the Arabian Gulf, really represented a profound challenge to an assumption of absolute security in the United Arab Emirates.
hmm
We're focusing on the 2014 murder of Ibolya Ryan in Abu Dhabi, and our goal here is to go far beyond the headlines, to really dissect the facts of the crime, the investigation, and the geopolitical implications of what was just a terribly tragic event.
It's, almost impossible to overstate the shock this caused at the time. The sources we have make it very clear that high-profile violence, especially something linked to terrorist ideology, it's statistically almost non-existent in the UAE.
It's a cornerstone of their society, that's security.
It's the foundation of the nation's success, really. So when this murder happened in December 2014, it wasn't just seen as the local crime. It sent this ripple of fear through the massive population of foreign expatriates.
Right, the teachers, the engineers, the bankers.
Exactly. The people who underpin the economy and who rely completely on that state promise of stability. It was an immediate, jarring shock, and it demanded an equally rapid and visible response from the state.
Absolutely. And before we get into the timeline of the violence itself, we really must ground this in the person at the center of it all. Ibolya Ryan.
Yeah.
She was a Hungarian-American kindergarten teacher, a dedicated educator who had chosen Abu Dhabi as her home. And the human tragedy here is just immense. She was a mother of 3 children,
And her children were young.
very young. Her 11-year-old twin sons were actually living with her in Abu Dhabi at the time. She also had a 13-year-old daughter who was residing in Vienna, Austria, with her ex-husband.
So this act of calculated ideological violence against a seemingly random person in a public mall,
Yeah.
it just struck right at the heart of that community she was a part of.
It did, and you mentioned the specific targeting. A kindergarten teacher, a mother inside a shopping mall restroom.
That resonated with a uniquely deep fear. It suggested that even the most, benign everyday activities could carry a risk. It completely shattered that perception that the UAE was somehow impervious to the kind of lone wolf violence that was already happening in other parts of the world.
And the fact that she was an expat professional, that just compounded the anxiety within that huge international community.
Absolutely.
So let's start by reconstructing the events of that day. The attack took place on a Monday. It was December 1st, 2014, and the location was the Boutique Mall on Al Reem Island in Abu Dhabi. What did the initial police findings tell us about the act itself?
Well, the investigation established that Ibolya Ryan was tragically stabbed to death inside one of the women's restrooms in the mall. The weapon was described by police simply as a sharp tool.
Which is intentionally vague, I assume.
Right, it's very typical for initial reports. But subsequent evidence suggested it was a large kitchen knife, something capable of inflicting very rapid, fatal wounds. And crucially, the sources indicate that the stabbing came after some kind of argument or confrontation inside the restroom.
And identifying the perpetrator was a huge problem from the very beginning, wasn't it? Because of their appearance, the media came up with a nickname almost immediately.
They did. The Reem Island Ghost. That moniker became instantly recognizable across the entire region.
It's a chilling name.
It is. The description, which was based on witness accounts and, more importantly, extensive CCTV footage, was of an individual who was completely covered. They were wearing a full black abaya, black gloves, and a face-covering veil, the niqab.
So complete anonymity.
Total anonymity, and that created immediate investigative problems, which the authorities openly acknowledged.
That's a key point in the sources, right? That initial confusion. The authorities actually had to state publicly that they couldn't even confirm the gender of the attacker.
Precisely. On December 3rd, so 2 days after the crime, the Abu Dhabi police explicitly addressed this. They said, and I'm quoting here, "Investigations are still underway to identify the suspect's identity and gender." They confirmed witnesses saw the culprit fully covered.
So they had to consider the possibility it could be a man in disguise.
They had to. Ruling that out was a necessary first step. It just emphasizes how the full covering made even basic identification impossible without more evidence. And of course, that level of uncertainty just fueled the public fear. The attacker was truly faceless, genderless, in those first critical hours.
So the entire investigation then pivoted to the surveillance system, which, given the UAE's reputation, you'd expect to be comprehensive.
And it was. The footage became the single most critical piece of evidence.
What does this CCTV actually tell us about the timeline, the movements of the attacker?
The footage provides an almost minute-by-minute account of the attacker's approach and then their escape. And it demonstrates a cold premeditation. The suspect is first seen stepping out of an elevator into the mall lobby.
And how are they moving?
Witnesses described their pace as deliberate, unhurried, not like someone who's nervous or agitated. And then there's this strange, almost mundane detail captured on the camera.
What's that?
The attacker briefly pauses, interacts with a uniformed security guard, and then casually picks up a newspaper before turning and walking toward the restrooms.
That's incredibly chilling. A normal interaction just moments before.
It is. It highlights the complete camouflage the disguise provided,
Yeah.
and the perpetrator's absolute calmness before committing this horrible act.
That moment of normalcy juxtaposed with what was about to happen, it's just so unsettling. And then there's that big, unexplained gap in the timeline.
Yes, the 90-minute gap. This is critical. The sources confirm the suspect remained in or near that restroom area for about an hour and a half before they came out again.
90 minutes, that's a very long time.
It's highly unusual for an impulsive attack. Investigators really focused on this gap to try and figure out the intent. Was the attacker waiting for a specific type of victim, someone who, as was later established, looked foreign? Or was there a long struggle with the victim?
We don't know for sure.
The exact details of the moments leading up to the stabbing remain private, but the duration itself suggests planning and patience, not spontaneity.
And then after that 90-minute wait, when the suspect finally exits, that's when the chaos starts.
That's the moment everyone in the mall knew something terrible had just happened. The attacker is seen suddenly running back into the lobby. Shoppers are scattering. They sense the danger immediately.
And someone tried to stop them.
The sources describe a woman who, in an immediate reaction to the person running, and maybe sounds of distress, tried to intervene, to physically stop the suspect. But the attacker just shook her off,
And then fled.
boarded an elevator straight to the parking garage, and fled the mall.
But the camera inside the mall, it captured the definitive proof of the crime.
Absolutely. The final frames of the footage from that area confirmed the violence. They showed a very clear, bloody trail of footprints leading from one of the restroom stalls out toward the lobby.
So that was the visual forensic proof.
It was. And beyond that, the video gave investigators crucial details, the specific gait of the suspect, their mannerisms, the exact timing. All of that became foundational for the rapid identification process that followed. The whole sequence, from that unhurried entry to the panic and the bloody exit, it was all preserved on tape.
And considering those initial obstacles, the disguise, no immediate ID, the speed with which the police tracked down and arrested the person responsible it was extraordinary, almost a statement in itself.
It was an incredible demonstration of the security service's capabilities. And that was clearly an intentional message to the public and the world. General Sheikh Saif bin Zayed Al Nahyan, who is the Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Interior, he announced the arrest on the morning of Thursday, December 4th.
And he was very specific about the timeline.
Very. He didn't just announce an arrest. He stated that the suspect was identified in under 24 hours of the crime and then arrested in less than 48 hours. That efficiency was paramount for the government to restore that feeling of security. It demonstrated that, while the nation might be vulnerable to this kind of inspired violence, the mechanism for justice was ruthlessly effective and swift.
A clear signal that any act that jeopardized the nation's stability would be met with an overwhelmingly powerful and rapid response.
Yes.
But the picture that emerged after the arrest revealed that the violence wasn't contained to just that one tragic incident in the mall.
That is exactly where this case grew so much more complex and so much more threatening. After the arrest, the focus shifted to who this person was.
There was some confusion at first, wasn't there?
There was. Initial international reports were slightly divergent. They named her as a 38-year-old Yemeni-born UAE citizen, Alaa al-Hashemi. There was some local confusion over a different name, Dalal al-Hashemi, but ultimately, she was confirmed to be an Emirati woman named Alaa Badr Abdullah.
Also known as Alaa Badr Abdullah al-Hashemi.
Right, and the key finding was that she was a citizen of the UAE and the sole perpetrator.
And the sources reveal that the murder of Ibolya Ryan was just the first part of what authorities quickly realized was a broader plan. She moved on to a second target immediately.
Yes. The sequence of events is just chilling. Immediately after the stabbing at the boutique mall, the suspect drove directly to a residential building on the Abu Dhabi Corniche, a different part of the city.
And this was the target of the second attack?
It was. The home of an Egyptian-American expatriate physician who was identified only by his initials, MH. He was 46 years old.
And the second crime wasn't a stabbing. It was an attempted bombing, potentially designed for mass casualties.
That is correct. Security video from this residential building showed the suspect arriving, and she was carrying a very distinct small black suitcase. She placed it right at the doorstep of the physician's apartment and then quickly left.
But the device failed to detonate.
Thankfully, yes.
And its discovery was purely by chance, wasn't it?
Incredibly fortunate timing. The bomb was found by the physician's 13-year-old son. He was just leaving the family apartment to go to the mosque for evening prayers when he saw this suspicious black suitcase sitting on their doorstep.
What a thing for a child to find.
Unimaginable. He told his father, the physician, who immediately and very prudently called the police.
Oh.
They rushed to the scene, evacuated the area, and specialists were able to dismantle the device before it could be triggered.
It's worth getting into the details of that device. It was described as primitive, but the components showed a really malevolent intent.
The term primitive can be misleading. It usually just means it lacks sophisticated electronic triggers or military-grade explosives, but it doesn't diminish the lethal intent at all.
So what was inside?
Colonel Rashid Boshid, the head of the Criminal Investigation Department, he provided a detailed breakdown. The key components were small gas cylinders, a lighter mechanism to act as a detonator, glue to hold it all together, and, critically, a large quantity of nails.
Nails. For shrapnel.
Exactly. The sources are specific that these nails weren't just thrown in, they were meticulously placed and arranged to cause maximum injuries upon detonation. This confirmed for investigators that the goal was not just property damage. The goal was severe harm or death to the physician and his family.
And the official news agency used that primitive construction to make a point, didn't they?
They did. The Wham news agency emphasized those details to support the narrative that this was an act learned through online instruction, not through professional hands-on training from a terror group.
So police released video evidence that definitively linked the murder at the mall to this attempted bombing on the Corniche. What was the smoking gun, forensically?
The physical evidence was overwhelming. The police video showed the suspect's vehicle, a white SUV, and inside that vehicle, blood from Ibolya Ryan was clearly visible on the steering wheel. That provided the direct forensic link.
Okay, so that's undeniable.
Undeniable. And furthermore, authorities found a black suitcase in the suspect's possession that was identified as being identical to the one used to carry the bomb to the apartment. So you have the blood transfer, the identical luggage, and the CCTV timeline from both locations. It made the case for a single perpetrator carrying out two distinct, ideologically driven attacks completely solid.
And the revelation that this was a coordinated dual attack that prompted an exceptionally strong condemnation from the highest levels of government.
Yes. Sheikh Saif bin Zayed Al Nahyan's public statement was very highly charged. He intentionally framed this crime not just as a security failure, but as an affront to the national and religious identity of the UAE.
What did he say?
He stated it was a slap to every noble human value that the UAE cherishes, all of which are derived from the teachings of Islam and the genuine Arab heritage.
That's very strong language.
It is. And that rhetoric served a dual purpose. First, to mourn the loss of life, of course. But second, to immediately separate the perpetrator's ideology from the mainstream values of the nation. It reinforced the idea that this was an isolated act of extremism, something completely contrary to the core tenets of the country.
And that distinction, framing it as an ideological assault that was fundamentally un-Emirati, that leads us directly into how they officially classified this crime, which had immediate strategic importance. The decision by the Emirates to classify the murder as a lone wolf terrorist attack was highly significant. For a country that depends so much on its reputation for stability, using the word terrorism carries enormous weight. Why was that such a high-stakes decision?
Well, this was arguably the most strategic decision the UAE government made in the aftermath. The entire UAE economy runs on international trust, on foreign investment, and on the physical presence of millions of skilled expatriates. If they had classified this as a simple homicide, it might have been manageable in a way.
But they didn't.
No. By classifying it as terrorism, the state officially acknowledged that ideological violence had, in fact, breached its borders.
But there's a really crucial nuance in the specific term they used. Lone wolf.
Exactly. And the strategic insight there is paramount. By immediately and consistently labeling the attack as a personal instigation and a lone terrorist act, the government sent two messages at the same time.
What were they?
The first message was to the international community. This was a terrorist act, and we take the global threat seriously. But the second and far more crucial message was internal and economic. This was a lone individual acting without any cell support.
And that distinction is vital.
It is, because confirming a lone wolf attack means there is no entrenched, organized terror cell operating within the UAE. That mitigates the risk assessment for foreign businesses and for citizens. It suggests a vulnerability to inspiration, but not to internal structural collapse. If an organized cell had been discovered, the economic consequences could have been catastrophic.
So the official explanation for her radicalization became central to maintaining that distinction. It focused entirely on the internet.
That's right. The analysis from security officials was clear. The killer had accessed terrorist websites. And on those sites, she acquired the terrorism ideology and learned how to manufacture explosives. This narrative placed the source of the problem outside the UAE's physical borders, on the radicalizing power of the internet, while simultaneously highlighting that she acted alone. She was inspired and self-taught, not directed by a local entity.
And the stated motive, reported by officials, it speaks volumes about the indiscriminate nature of this kind of terrorism. She was reportedly looking for anyone who looks foreign.
That motive, anyone who looks foreign, confirms the link between this isolated domestic crime and the much broader global conflict happening at the time. Late 2014 was a period of extremely high tension, directly tied to the rise of the Islamic State. And the murder of Ibolya Ryan came right after a September 2014 statement by Abu Muhammad al-Adnani.
Who was the spokesman for ISIL at the time?
Yes, for the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant.
And that statement wasn't subtle. It was a direct instruction to followers all over the world.
It was an unambiguous global call to violence. It urged Muslims everywhere to murder Westerners and citizens of any country that was part of the coalition fighting against ISIL. And the instruction was incredibly permissive about the method. It said, kill him in any manner or way, however it may be.
And the UAE was a part of that coalition.
A very active, high-profile participant. They were conducting airstrikes. So the murder of an American-Hungarian teacher in Abu Dhabi instantly gained this immense political and retaliatory weight. It was seen as a direct response to the UAE's foreign policy.
So this incident in Abu Dhabi is then viewed, in the context of our source material, not as some kind of anomaly, but as part of a global, observable trend of decentralized violence.
It absolutely fits that pattern. The sources frame this as part of a definite trend of terrorist acts through inspiration, rather than a direct order from militant groups.
Yeah.
This concept of inspirational terror is, well, it's terrifying for security agencies because it requires no sophisticated logistics. It requires no communication network for them to intercept.
All it requires is an internet connection and a will to act.
Exactly. And the sources cite numerous other examples from that same time period. The 2014 ramming attack in Saint-Jean-sur-Richelieu in Canada, the beheading of the French tourist Hervé Gordel in Algeria, various killings of foreigners in Saudi Arabia.
And they all share that same characteristic.
Yes, they were all perpetrated by individuals acting on a general ideological command that was spread through extremist media rather than on specific operational instructions from a handler.
It's the ultimate security challenge, isn't it? How do you possibly preempt a lone individual who radicalizes in isolation in their own home and then suddenly decides to act on a global instruction? This must have forced a fundamental reassessment of security across the whole region.
It did. And that reassessment very quickly translated into concrete warnings from foreign governments to their own nationals living in the Gulf.
Let's turn now to the reverberations of this attack, specifically within the UAE's enormous expatriate community. The source material really emphasizes that this murder profoundly shook these residents. It shattered a long-held perception of invulnerability.
The sense of security in the UAE wasn't just an assumption. It was a major selling point for anyone thinking of relocating there. Expats expected, and they generally received, a level of safety that was often far superior to their own home countries.
Right.
So the fact that a seemingly mundane, protected space, a clean, well-lit shopping mall restroom on an upscale island, was the site of this kind of violence, it just dissolved that safety bubble overnight.
People realized that if a teacher could be targeted randomly like this,
then anyone could be. The fear was pervasive among foreign nationals. They suddenly had to reconcile the reality of global terror with this tightly controlled environment they had been promised.
And this shift in local perception was very quickly mirrored by international government advisories. They provided official confirmation that the risk profile in the Gulf had fundamentally changed.
That's right. Governments abroad had to react to the new data. For example, the UK's Foreign and Commonwealth Office, the FCO, they acted swiftly. Within days, on December 5th, they issued new warnings to British nationals.
And what did they say?
Their advice specifically stated that indiscriminate attacks could be made on foreigners in the Gulf states. They formalized the danger by advising of a heightened threat of terrorist attack globally against UK interests and British nationals from groups or individuals motivated by the conflict in Iraq and Syria.
That's a significant escalation from previous advisories.
It is. Previous warnings usually focus on general political stability, not this kind of personal, random violence.
And the U.S. response from the Overseas Security Advisory Council, or OSAC, was equally sobering, especially in the details of their advice.
The U.S. OSAC issued a security advisory that was highly unusual for the UAE environment. They urged Americans living in the Gulf to fundamentally adjust their routines. Specifically, they advised nationals to vary their routines and schedules.
In a place where predictability and stability are the norm, that's a drastic warning.
It is. It means changing your route to work, altering meeting times, avoiding predictable patterns. These are all actions you'd typically associate with high-threat environments, not the highly secure expatriate bubble of Abu Dhabi.
And the sources even point out that the threat to educators specifically was not entirely unforeseen.
Indeed. It was noted that American security officials had previously warned expatriates, particularly those working in the Middle East, about jihadist web postings that explicitly urged attacks on teachers in American schools.
How chilling.
It is. It confirms that Ibolya Ryan, as a kindergarten teacher with clear Western ties, tragically fit the exact profile that radical elements had already identified as a desirable target. It validated those earlier warnings in the most horrible way.
Before we move on to the judicial conclusion of this case, let's just revisit the victim's life for a moment. The sources provide some moving details about Ibolya Ryan's background, which really contextualize her as a global citizen whose life was centered on education.
And giving her story the detail it deserves is essential. Ibolya Ryan was a naturalized U.S. citizen, and she also held Hungarian citizenship. She was born and raised in Transylvania, Romania. And her journey was one of significant personal courage and self-determination. She actually defected to Hungary as a young adult.
So her background was one of moving across borders, building a new life.
Yes, seeking opportunity. And that deeply informs her later career choices.
She had an incredibly international teaching career.
She did. Over a span of about 15 years, she taught in 4 different countries, including the United States. She's self-described as Hungarian-American. Her professional life was one of constantly relocating for new roles, of embracing that expat lifestyle that eventually brought her to Abu Dhabi.
So she was clearly a dedicated, adaptive person.
Absolutely. The sources mentioned she and her husband had lived in Sopron, Hungary, with their 3 children for 8 years before their divorce and her subsequent move to the UAE. This context is so important because it just illustrates that the victim was a dedicated professional and a mother, making her death not only tragic, but just utterly senseless in its ideological motivation.
Following her death, the community response was immediate, and it focused on supporting her children.
The humanitarian response was very rapid. The recruitment firm that had brought her to Abu Dhabi immediately set up a fundraising effort. Initially, this was meant to cover the expensive costs of repatriating her body and to provide educational support for her children.
And the family eventually took it over.
Yes, eventually the family took over management of the fund, directing it to assist relatives back in Romania. Furthermore, the UAE government provided assistance with the final logistics, and her body was eventually transported to and buried in Simian, Romania, at her family's plot. This immediate humanitarian aid provided at least some measure of closure amidst all the security concerns.
And that brings us to the final necessary chapter of this case, the judicial process and the swift conclusion delivered by the state. Because this crime was immediately classified as a threat to national security, the case bypassed the standard criminal courts. It was heard directly by the Federal Supreme Court in Abu Dhabi. And that level of judicial scrutiny really underscores the political gravity of these charges.
That's right. The Federal Supreme Court handles cases designated as state security issues. In late June of 2015, the defendant, Ala Bader al-Hashemi, was convicted. But her conviction wasn't just for the single act of murder. It encompassed the full ideological scope of her crimes, reflecting the state's determination to prosecute the terrorist intent behind them.
She was convicted of several charges, which highlighted her connection to a global terror network, even if she acted as a so-called lone wolf.
Absolutely. The charges were specific and they were devastating. First, obviously, she was convicted of the murder of Ibolya Ryan. Second, and crucially, she was found guilty of sending money to al-Qaeda in Yemen.
And that's a direct link.
It's a direct financial connection to an internationally recognized terrorist organization. It provided the legal foundation for that terrorism classification. Third, She was convicted of publishing information aimed at harming the reputation of the Emirates.
That third charge might seem administrative, but it's very significant.
It's highly significant in a country that actively promotes its image as a global hub for commerce and tourism. The court was penalizing her for the ideological attack on the UAE's stability and its international standing.
And based on this confluence of severe convictions, the court imposed the maximum penalty available.
Al-Abidar al-Hashemi was sentenced to death in late June 2015. And the sources are explicit about the legal finality of this. Under the specific laws governing state security crimes in the UAE, the ruling of the Federal Supreme Court was unappealable.
No appeal.
None. This immediate closure signaled the state's unambiguous and final condemnation of both the act itself and the ideology behind it.
Now we have to address the complex legal maneuvering around the mental health defense, which she reportedly introduced during the proceedings. This is a critical legal aspect of the case.
It is, and it required very careful judicial handling. Al-Hashemi did request psychological help. She claimed she suffered from a chronic mental illness and that she experienced unreal visions.
In many legal systems, a defense like that, if substantiated, could mitigate a death sentence.
It could, or at least change the determination of culpability. However, the Federal Supreme Court, recognizing the seriousness of this defense in a capital case, did not just dismiss it out of hand.
So how did the court proceed? How did they assess the validity of her claims against what appeared to be premeditated crimes?
The court took the necessary legal step. They ordered specific independent psychiatric tests. These were not tests administered by her defense team, but by court-appointed experts. The goal was rigorous, to determine if her mental condition rendered her legally incapable of understanding the criminal nature and the consequences of her actions at the time of the murder and the attempted bombing.
And what did these court-ordered psychiatric exams find?
The experts concluded definitively that despite any underlying psychological issues she may have had, Al-Hashemi had been fully aware of her actions.
So she knew what she was doing.
The court's determination was that her mental condition was, quote, not found to have affected her actions. In the eyes of the law, she understood the severity, the planning, and the lethal intent behind the murder of Ibolya Ryan and the attempted mass casualty bombing. This finding was absolutely essential because it allowed the death sentence to stand. It confirmed that the state viewed these acts as premeditated terrorism, not the uncontrolled actions of a mentally incapacitated individual.
And the swiftness of the final ruling, from the sentence to the execution, that was also noted by the sources as a definitive closing statement by the government.
The speed was strategically significant. The execution of Al-Abidar Abdullah was carried out just weeks after the sentence was handed down. Ahmed al-Danhani, who was the Attorney General for the state security prosecution, announced that the execution occurred on the morning of Monday, July 13, 2015.
And it required presidential approval.
Yes, it followed the required approval of the then-president, Khalifa bin Zayed Al Nahyan. The rapid implementation of that death penalty was a final, powerful action. It was intended to demonstrate that the UAE would tolerate zero ambiguity or protracted judicial proceedings when it came to threats against national security and ideological violence. It reinforced the state's image of unshakable stability.
This examination of the Ibolya Ryan case, from the shock of the Reem Island ghost to that final, rapid judicial resolution, it really provides a complete picture of a secure state adapting to the unique threat posed by this kind of lone wolf, ideologically motivated violence. It tested the nation's security mechanisms, and it forced a global reassessment of regional stability.
It showed that even the most controlled environments are vulnerable to radical inspiration that's propagated online. But it also demonstrated the UAE's capacity for an immediate, systemic, and unyielding response.
As we conclude this intensive analysis, the details of this case leave us with some profound questions, regarding the law's ability to handle this intersection of pathology and politics. When an act is classified simultaneously as a deliberate murder and as politically motivated terrorism, as this one was, and then the defense introduces claims of mental illness, what unique challenges does this pose for determining moral culpability versus strict legal responsibility, especially when a system moves with such speed to deliver justice? This case provides a stark example of a judicial framework designed to prioritize a clear, decisive, and rapid message of security to the nation and to the world.